Welcome to Lesson 15, again continuing our focus on specific challenging behaviors. And in this video, we'll talk about behaviors that are physically aggressive or verbally aggressive, behaviors that threaten us or there's violence in them. What do they look like? Well, they can look like strikes of any kind, including strikes with our hands or feet or body, or with objects. Sometimes these are objects that are meant as weapons, such as knives from the kitchen counter, or objects that are not intended as weapons but become weapons in a moment, such as a pencil or a rock. And these include the attempts by people to do so, not just when they actually are successful. Grabs of our clothing, our hair, or our whole body are other examples, even bites. But we can also include things that are said, such as threatening statements or gestures. Those are actual acts of aggression as well. Now, I want to make a big distinction between a person calling us a name or yelling and an act of aggression. Those first things of people yelling and screaming or calling us a name are not actually aggressive behaviors. They're behaviors that are ventilating and clearly angry, but we need to make this distinction between a person meaning to cause us harm and a person just getting out their anger. They're different and their responses are different. How do we manage them? Well, the most important thing we have to do is stay calm. And we have to remember what I call the safety priority. The number one priority for safety is ourselves. Why? For a very simple reason. If we get hurt, nothing good is going to happen here. We have to stay well in order to do the right thing. So we never put ourselves in a circumstance where we know it's likely that we're going to get hurt. For example, it is a misconception that it's up to us to break up fights physically. If we did that, we're just likely to get punched or hurt ourselves. There are times when, for example, we have a coworker arrive on scene when it might become safer to do it, but we don't just jump in. We're first going to protect ourselves, and then second, we're going to start looking at all the other stakeholders around an agitated individual, including other clients, other staff, and members of the public. And then, if it's safe to do so, we're going to become concerned with that individual. And finally, as a fourth priority, valuable property. Now, if we're smart about this, we can often address all four things. But we should not sacrifice our safety for the safety of other people. We first protect ourselves. And our most basic strategy is called proximity control. Or, as Sting and the Police said, don't stand so close to me. We want to make sure that we create distance between ourselves and that agitated person. Not just distance that keeps them from being able to reach us with one blow or one kick, but distance that allows us a moment to be able to respond. We want to also think about things like the barriers that are between us and other people. For example, something as simple as having a desk or a table between us means that it'll be harder for people to come straight at us. We should also be mindful of escape routes. What doors are we going to go through? And how do these things work with barriers? For example, is a barrier keeping us from getting to an escape route? We also want to control the stimuli in the environment. That stimuli can include things like noise and activity. It can include light. It can also include eyes and ears that people might feel paying attention to them and watching them. Sometimes it's easier to ask the audience to leave the room, even though it might be many people, than it is to ask the agitated person to leave the room. Sometimes it's about turning down lights, closing windows to put out other noise, removing TVs or radios or turning them off, and those kinds of things can make a profound difference. This is not a time, you'll remember from our crisis intervention module, to try and apply a consequential, a teaching strategy, or anything that's terribly verbal, because the person is so emotionally aroused that their rational ability is at its lowest point, and any amount of stimulus is going to be perceived as a threat, as an overwhelming stimulus. And therefore the person will start trying to defend against it, which can look like aggressive behavior. By far, the most important thing for us to do is to focus on prevention. We have to learn from each incidence of their violent and aggressive behaviors. So we have to address the underlying issues with people, really getting at the proactive strategies. And we'll talk more and more about these as the course continues for those of you who are going into the first semester next fall. But really getting into these skills of how we help people with their underlying needs is critical. We have to work with our team to create a crisis intervention plan, as we've already learned in the module 205, and that plan should be based on the arousal cycle analysis. Now, that doesn't strictly prevent people from being upset, but it does likely prevent them from being escalated to higher stages of arousal, and therefore more likely dangerous stages of arousal, if we intervene early and effectively. So what would you do based on what you've learned in this module and in others if you were in this case? You've never seen Vasily get angry before. In other words, he doesn't have a crisis intervention plan. He's usually quite calm, but when he finds out that the movie he wants to see is sold out, he doesn't seem to understand. He screams, then he grabs the sleeve of your shirt as you start to leave the theater. How would you respond? And what kinds of things could be done to prevent this situation? Remember, Vasily is not known as a person who acts out, so that changes the dimension here a little bit.